to me, the Republicans have given up on a mass majority in this country, turning more towards violence. I'm much more worried about a post-election scenario that could be much worse than January 6, 2021. 2020, when we had 3 armed paramilitary groups roaming around following Black Lives Matter, being backed up by the police, there was kind of this view of them, oh, these are vigilantes. They're operating outside the law. What these paramilitaries were is they weren't taking the law into their own hands. They were targeting people because of their race, religion, political beliefs. They were armed wings of fascist movements. If you look at this idea of illegal vigilantism, what happens when a sheriff deputizes these guys and they set up roadblocks? In certain situations, the law is malleable and flexible. If you're hanging your hat on that idea of illegality, what happens when they're given this legal veneer?
Welcome to episode 220 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. In today's episode, we're sharing an interview with Zoltán Grossman, discussing his essay published on Counterpunch titled Lessons of Kristallnacht, quote-unquote civil war and mass deportation. Thanks to our patrons who make this show possible. Patrons, final reminder, join us for our next virtual event, a discussion of the War Game film. We're going to meet Sunday, October 13th via Zoom, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific. If you want to join us, sign up over at patreon.com/refusefascism. If you are not yet a patron, sign up to become one for as little as $2 a month over at that same place, patreon.com/refusefascism, and you will get information so that you can register. Once you register, you'll get the link to our Zoomie. Looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks to those who are helping in other ways, like spreading the imperative by purchasing and wearing our Refuse Fascism t-shirts. Want to get yours? See a link in the show notes. And those who take the extra step to share the show, to rate, review, and subscribe, which helps more people discover this resource and join the community at this urgent hour. I want to give a shout out to 2 folks who commented on last week's episode over on YouTube. You can find us on YouTube at refuse_fascism. Make sure to subscribe if YouTube's your thing. So here are the reviews. At Bill Wolf 6638 wrote, Sam, you were on fire. One of your finest and razor-sharp critiques of the fascist threat. Thanks, Bill. And another at First Man in Rome wrote, wow, that was out of this late-stage capitalism world. This pod gets better and better as times get worse. Well, thanks, First Man in Rome. I'm not sure if that's true, but really appreciate it. So go be like Bill Wolf and First Man in Rome and comment, rate, review, subscribe, share, do whatever you can do to bring this to others. Hopefully after today's show, you'll be inspired to be like them. Before we get to the interview, I want to touch on some developments. On Wednesday, a federal judge unsealed Jack Smith's court filing charging Trump over his quote-unquote unofficial actions to foment a coup in 2021 and exposing yet another aspect of this ongoing fascist plot in great detail. In fact, I think 165 pages worth of detail. In light of this extensive evidence of election interference, Trump has claimed that the judge's release of the filing itself is election interference against him. Part of a grand conspiracy involving the DOJ, Jack Smith, and of course, the Democratic Party. Most essentially, however, I need to say this, in part thanks to the Supreme Court, no such trial on these crimes, let alone a conviction, will occur before the election. Over the past 2 weeks, catastrophic flooding from Hurricane Helene has impacted millions of people in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, and Virginia. Our hearts go out to those affected. We've heard heroic stories about neighbors helping neighbors, and federal and state aid has begun reaching these areas. It must be said that our society is not geared towards ensuring people's welfare in normal times, let alone preparing and helping in emergencies. But instead of addressing that reality, the MAGA movement has seized on this storm to spread deadly disinformation, serving their fascist agenda, and whip up racist and xenophobic hate. In North Carolina, Trump spread a number of outright lies about the hurricane response. Listen here.
Kamala should be here. She shouldn't be anywhere else. And they're missing $1 billion that they gave to migrants coming into our country. Some of them are murderers. Some of them are drug dealers. Some of them, many of them, 13,099 murderers came into our country during their 3.5. And we're missing $1 billion they gave them to the migrants that came in. And now we don't have the money. We'll do it. But they don't have the money to take care of it. That's why they're giving you lousy treatment in North Carolina in particular. And we don't like that, so we're going to let it be known. And they have to get a lot better because people are not happy.
Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene furthered this, tweeting, quote, "Yes, they can control the weather," end quote, propping up a wide array of conspiracies as to why they might have done this. Elon Musk and other fascist operatives have spread even more lies about the federal government blocking him from flying in devices to reconnect these areas to the internet, when that same federal government has in fact been facilitating bringing in Musk-owned Starlink services for that purpose. This is not valid criticism of systemic failure. It's not even run-of-the-mill criticism of a competing candidate. This disinformation is most immediately hindering actual aid for everyone, discouraging his base from getting much needed aid, and confusing other survivors as to what resources are available. It is scapegoating migrants in classic Nazi fashion, building on the bomb threat-backed moral panic over Haitian people living in Ohio and Venezuelans in Aurora, Colorado.
Very unfortunate from that standpoint. You have illegal, you have the migrants, you're reading about it. Now, a lot of the money that was supposed to go to Georgia and supposed to go to North Carolina and all of the others is going and has gone already. It's been gone for people that came into the country illegally, and nobody's ever seen anything like that. That's a shame. That's what's happening. They stole the FEMA money just like they stole it from a bank so they could give it to their illegal immigrants that they want to have vote for them this season.
These lies would be dangerous on their own. But if you actually listen to Trump for any period of time, it becomes clear that these lies are part of a cohesive plan to blame any election loss, which in his mythology would mean the destruction of the country, on a vast conspiracy of the deep state, the Democratic Party, migrants, Marxists, quote-unquote the media, otherworldly forces, the devil, and the Jews. Trump doesn't always pull out the whole Charlie Day stringboard, but he consistently pulls these threads together anytime there is a mic in front of him. This is a model of textbook fascist unreality, and it's dangerous as hell. Back in February, we had disinformation expert Lee McIntyre on the program, and I highly recommend going back and listening to that show, along with some others that I lift up in the show notes. He made an apt analogy on the fascist use of disinformation that, quote, "I think a lot of people, including some very savvy journalists, misunderstand what we're up against, and they keep talking about this as if it were a natural disaster. Using the word misinformation, I think, is to pretend that this is a hurricane and we don't know where it came from. And of course it's dangerous, but put your head down and we'll try to get through it. This is not a hurricane. This is something that is more akin to warfare, and it's created by people on purpose to get what they want," end quote. And that's not all. More recently on this show, we discussed how fascist propaganda against public schools serves not to improve those schools, but entirely undermine them, with the goal of abolishing free and publicly accountable education. This disinformation campaign likewise serves to undermine FEMA, not to improve federal emergency response, but to end it along with all social services and the very notion that government should do anything more than wage wars against people abroad and brutalize the people at home into submission. It has gotten so intense that FEMA itself has had to publish a lengthy FAQ on their website explicitly to debunk these rumors, with videos debunking that they can control the weather. And even many Republican state officials and agencies have had to take significant time away from their work to call out these lies and explain and re-explain basic realities. More than anything, Trump and the MAGA movement's disinformation campaign regarding Hurricane Helene serves to deepen the MAGA delusion that Trump is the only authority on what is true and what is not, in particular at a moment when Trump is gearing up to subvert the election. Speaking of which, we are now a month away from the election, and the line between potential election violence and current reality is beginning to blur, with intensifying acts of intimidation and harassment against election officials. The Department of Homeland Security has issued a report asserting that, in their words, quote, unquote, violent extremists pose an escalated threat to the voting process. Fascists have shot up the homes of at least 3 election officials in New Mexico. A man filmed himself barging into a New Mexico elections office, screaming about workers stealing the election without any evidence, posted the video, and garnered a wave of violent threats and harassment against the local officials. Election officials have been the target of attempted swatting, where fascists use fake 911 calls to send trigger-happy SWAT teams storming into a person's home. And election officials have been sent mysterious white powder through the mail. David Nakamura and Yvonne Winget-Sanchez for the Washington Post report, quote, local election officials have made more than 2,000 reports of disruptive protesters and menacing emails, phone messages, and social media posts, end quote, going on to claim that, quote, justice officials say they are limited in taking more aggressive actions because of free speech protections and longstanding department policies based on federal law that prohibits stationing armed federal personnel at polling sites, end quote. The story fails to mention the interesting fact that the short history of such federal presence at voting sites just happens to be the history of the few attempts to ensure African Americans access to the polls during the Reconstruction and at the end of Jim Crow. The report is a window into a zealous, militant, and heavily armed element of the MAGA movement, whose members are extremely tuned in to their dear leader and extensively connected to their fascist peers, even if not all traditionally organized. And the threat is not just more of these incidents. It's not even just a January 6th do-over. This represents the readiness of just one potentially vital part of a living and growing plan that also includes Project 2025. It includes Trump's refusal to accept the results in advance. It includes tens of millions of fascists who believe that Trump is the authority on the truth. It includes an effectively fascist Supreme Court. It includes potential support from sections of the military, which itself admits they are struggling to combat so-called extremism. There is a strong historical record to support that the readiness of Trump's base to commit acts of violence may well turn out to be a catalyst from all of what I just mentioned to come to fruition. According to a recent survey, 73% of likely voters expressed concern about the potential for, quote, politically motivated violence following the outcome of the 2024 presidential election, end quote. If you are someone who takes this reality seriously, don't forget to sign up for our patrons-only discussion via Zoom of the film War Game. Watch it beforehand. It's streaming on Apple TV and Amazon Prime. We're going to talk next Sunday, October 13th. Again, that's Sunday, October 13th, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific time. Go to our patreon.com/refusefascism page to sign up and join us. We got to talk about the debate, the VP debate, that is, because even SNL is commenting on the vibing between JD Vance and Walz. I'm going to keep my remarks on the VP debate short, where the loser, as usual, was all of us. Because it wasn't just that fascists put mascara on their pig, or at least a heavy dose of eyeliner, but that so many saw that pig and said, look how reasonable he is. How nice it is to have a reasonable debate. There was nothing moderate, reasonable, or non-fascistic about JD Vance on that debate stage. And yet, too many are convinced otherwise. Vance leveled up his Midwestern white man to paint Tim Walz as a Midwestern white man who is being duped by a black woman. I know you want to solve was a frequent theme of the evening. There was this quote that sums it up well that a friend of mine had shared on Instagram. It was of a quote from Christopher, a man who has a preference for Harris, lives in Wisconsin, and was quoted by the Washington Post as saying this about J.D. Vance. Quote, Vance did a fantastic job of showcasing what could be the future of Republican presidential candidates. He was poised and articulate and civil, but he is partnering with the exact opposite in Donald Trump. Trump's policies have proven to be dangerous and divisive. I cannot vote for a bully or for a campaign based in hate, end quote. So Vance accomplished, at least to too many, the polishing of fascism, making it more digestible without changing the content in the least. A fascist you could get behind. In what world is it tolerable, let alone civil, that the mass deportation of migrants be presented as a solution to a housing crisis? There is nothing legitimate or acceptable or palatable about a, quote, minimum national standard for abortion, end quote. That is called an abortion ban, a national abortion ban, for anyone confused. Yes, in the end, Walz challenged Vance on whether Vance would challenge the election results if Trump loses. But every step along the way, Vance was allowed to spread lethal lies ad nauseum, including about Trump doing a peaceful transfer of power in 2020. But do so while reaching a very low bar of decorum. It was another lesson in how the Democrats will not fight fascism the way it must be fought. Walz kept offering up Minnesota nice and a yearning bipartisanship and cozying up to Vance, while the very party that Vance represents is openly plotting their annihilation. So now, let's return to Trump and what Trump is promising. Last Sunday, Trump spoke at a campaign rally in Erie, PA, and said,
Do it because the liberal left won't let them do it. The liberal left wants to destroy them, and they want to destroy our country. You know, if you had one day, like one real rough, nasty day with the drugstores as an example, but they have to be taught. Now, if you had one really violent day, like a guy like Mike Kelly, put him in charge, Congressman Kelly, put him in charge for one day. Mike, would you say, he's right here, it's a chain of events that's so bad. One rough hour, and I mean real rough, the word will get out and it will end immediately. End immediately. You know, it'll end immediately.
He's describing The Purge, right? His words cribbed from the plot of the 2013 horror movie The Purge starring Ethan Hawke, where residents are unleashed to engage in violence on one day a year sans consequence. Sure, maybe he is. But let's be clear. What Trump is actually calling forward is not cribbed from Hollywood, but the Holocaust. What it is so eerily reminiscent of is not of horrific fantasy, but real-life hell of Kristallnacht, a wave of violent anti-Jewish pogroms in Germany that began November 9th, 1938. Why, Sam, you might ask? Does it matter? Isn't the point to just say it's a horror? No. See what happens. Oh my fucking God, he's quoting The Purge. Man is stupid. Man is crazy. But listen here. Oh my fucking God, he's planning the mass cleansing of society, writing Hitler fan fiction he aims to make real. And then maybe he isn't so stupid, so silly, and more like, man is lunatic, man is scary as hell, man is a fascist. What Trump was clearly calling for is a wave of extrajudicial executions of Black and Latino suspected criminals, which in the MAGA mind is all Black and Latino people, all non-white people, broadly, but without a doubt would not stop there. Kristallnacht was the Nazi declaration of all-out war against German and Austrian Jews, in which a campaign of vengeance and degradation was unleashed for 2 days. This effort, like what Trump dreams of, was not just ordinary people with permission of the state enacting violence, but was led by the SS, the elite Nazi organization, and the SA, the stormtroopers, in which others joined in, including Hitler Youth. This is what Trump is echoing when he speaks of the police being at the locus of this, and tells you a lot about how he views the police. Noah Berlatsky put it this way on Twitter, quote, "It's frightening because it's not fictional. There are plenty of examples of the state targeting marginalized people for mass violence. There's every reason to believe that Trump could actually institute mass murder of immigrants. end quote, going on to write, quote, Trump is promising genocide and ethnic cleansing on a terrifying scale. He's talked about removing 30 million people, end quote. In today's interview, Professor Grossman and I discuss Kristallnacht and the lessons for today. And I want you to keep this recent statement from Trump in mind when you listen. To close, I want to quote a recent essay from Henry Giroux. And even while Henry sticks with the comparison to the Purge, this rings true and essential. It is, quote, fascist rhetoric that frames politics as war with no limits on legality, morality, or humanity. It is a language soaked in the blood of history, recalling genocidal campaigns against Native Americans, Blacks, Jews, and countless others deemed disposable by authoritarian regimes. It is a dead language, a violent lexicon that gives birth to politicians with blood in their mouths, who weaponize fear, bigotry, and hatred, cloaking their destruction in the false promises of patriotism and security, end quote. With that, here is my interview with Zoltán Grossman. Today, we're going to talk about the lessons of Kristallnacht, the possibility of civil war and mass deportations. To do that, I am delighted to welcome onto the show Zoltán Grossman. Zoltán is a member of the faculty in Geography and Native American and Indigenous Studies at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. He's a longtime community organizer and was a co-founder of the Midwest Treaty Network Alliance for Tribal Sovereignty. He is the author of Unlikely Alliances, Native and White Communities Join to Defend Rural Lands, and the co-editor of Asserting Native Resilience, Pacific Rim Indigenous Nations Face the Climate Crisis. Welcome, Zoltán. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with many Americans know about Hitler's final solution when they think about the Nazis, when they think about fascism, they think about the final solution, the end stage of wholesale slaughter decided at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. But for large periods during the Nazis' rise to power, their solution to the so-called Jewish problem was mass deportation. And I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about what we can learn and what you've been learning from the Nazis' development from mass deportation to mass murder.
I learned quite a bit from a recent trip to Germany and Poland. I went to Auschwitz for the first time, where many of my Hungarian Jewish relatives were murdered. I did it to honor them and to understand more about that end of the story. But I also went to Nuremberg, to the parade grounds, and stood actually in the spot where Hitler gave his speeches and tried to understand how, as a social movement, they took control of Germany. And also visited the courtroom where many of the war criminals were tried after the war. But I've always been more interested in the early and mid stages of the Nazis' rise to power, because I think that affords the real lessons for us, not only in the United States, but in the West, because what we're facing is not limited to Trump in the United States. We're seeing, obviously, Germany, France, many other Western countries facing the same kind of toxic brew of anti-immigrant politics, calls for mass deportation, and the increasing rhetoric and reality of violence in the discourse. What really struck me was how Kristallnacht in particular was a turning point. The Nazis were in power, they were introducing legislation, but their hold on power was pretty tenuous in many ways. There was a lot of internal dissent within German society. There were a lot of internal schisms within the party itself. There were newcomers joining the party. Any one-party state kind of contains the seeds of its own demise, because if it's the only path to employment, you're going to have people who aren't true believers joining in. And apparently this was an issue at the time in 1936, 37, 38. A real turning point was when the party decided to institute a policy of mass deportation. They had instituted the Nuremberg laws in 1935, which introduced and strengthened wholesale discrimination against Jews, German Jews, against citizens who were Jews, but they hadn't yet dealt with the issue of the foreign-born Jews, some of whom were actually of foreign citizenship. Their parents had come from places like Poland, but they might have even been born in Germany, but they were still considered foreign Jews. In 1938, there was a mass deportation of Jews to Poland. And it was accompanied by really ferocious violence. About 12,000 Jews were forcibly expelled. It's interesting these days because the paramilitary mobs and some citizens that joined them, one of their chants was Juden raus auf nach Palästina, Jews out, go to Palestine, because that seemed to be compatible, the idea of Jews not belonging in Europe and, well, here's a place for them to go. So there wasn't popularized yet the idea of mass extermination. There were all sorts of proposals for deportation, whether to other European countries at first, to British Palestine, and so the common cause of getting the British out of the Middle East so Jews could go there instead of being in Europe. There are other proposals for Uganda, for Madagascar. That was the predominant final solution that had been presented to the German public. And this was very well known. It was actually a board game called Juden raus that went along with kind of this idea of deporting, at first, foreign Jews. The road to Kristallnacht was paved at this time because one of those deported Polish Jews ended up in Paris and ended up assassinating a German diplomat who was actually critical of the Nazis. And of course, the state took this as an excuse to implement some of the measures against both foreign and German Jews that had been long in planning. They were kind of looking for a trigger for a point at which to implement mass violence as a strategy. So that was Kristallnacht in November of 1938, after the mass deportation began, really in August, of foreign Jews. In November, the idea was to use an action by a foreign Jew in another country in order to unleash cataclysmic violence against the entire Jewish community in Germany. Kristallnacht was the mass burning of synagogues. Very few survived. I visited some of those. Jews were banned from attending school, from organizing cultural activities, from publishing, from owning weapons. Paramilitaries, together with ordinary citizens, destroyed hundreds of synagogues, thousands of shops and homes. They incarcerated 30,000 people, directly killed about 100 at the time, though many more, of course, were slain later. What I found really interesting from the record from a couple of sources is that Kristallnacht was really, really unpopular, even amongst the party rank and file. This gave Germany a bad name. Kaiser Wilhelm II, he was still alive at the time, and he said he was ashamed to be German. There was even a survey that said about 2/3 of party members disapproved of the pogrom. It looked too much like Tsarist Russia, and it looked too chaotic and illegal. And so they kind of used this legalistic argument. And of course, that led the party to change the laws to basically legalize this form of mass violence. So I found that really, really interesting. And I guess now when I see a poll on CNN that says, 70% of Republicans disapprove of violence, it's like, well, it doesn't really matter because the opinion of the party members back in 1938 didn't matter one bit. It was a cold, calculated strategy to introduce mass violence into the Jewish question, and also to shake up and institute further control over German society as a whole. It was a strategy of a minority. You don't need a majority in order to take control of a society politically. You need a combination of mobilization, of organizing, and in this case of terror, in order to destroy human rights and democracy. Polls give me cold comfort at this point because throughout history, and I think on both sides, what does Bolshevik mean in Russia? It actually meant minority. It was a minority faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party. The Mensheviks, the more social democratic types, more moderate, were called Mensheviks, which means the majority. The Bolsheviks as well were a minority faction within their political party, and yet they took decisive action in order to take power. I think that the warning signs from a well-organized minority faction that's determined to destroy the previous system, whatever that is, can be more effective than mobilizing majority opinion on their side. To me, the Republicans have given up on a mass majority in this country. They know they'll never get it, and it's getting more and more difficult. Exercising these decisive blows, turning more towards violence. I'm much more worried about a post-election scenario that could be much worse than January 6, 2021, given studying this history and studying the trends in recent days.
I share that concern as well. And I wanted to thank you for both walking us through that history and then making the comparisons to the moment that we're in right now and what lessons people should apply in this context. When I was reading your counterpunch piece that we're discussing, which is titled Lessons of Kristallnacht, Civil War and Mass Deportation, that was published September 2nd, earlier this month, one of the parts that struck me so much was not a poll, but was that reporting that 63% of Nazis disapproved of this outbreak of violence. It grabbed me that Kristallnacht was widely unpopular. I didn't know that before reading your piece. It struck me, and I was wondering, you spoke to the reasons why the disapproval didn't matter. And that's the applicability today of understanding that the majority view within their ranks doesn't matter. But I'm wondering, what do you think was going through people's heads at that time, those who disapproved, and how was that disapproval expressed?
Well, I think the problem was it was expressed as an opinion, but it wasn't backed up by action. I mean, there were a few coup plots that were going on through late 30s, early 40s. Some of the kind of bourgeois German nationalists who had fought in World War I were upset, kind of like the never-Trumpers today. But they were a distinct minority. There was a lot of dissent in the church. And I think there is the factor of fear. I think that's obvious when you're talking about this era, that people were afraid of being reported to the Gestapo. But when you see such kind of pervasive criticism, I think the problem is it was couched in legal terms, that German society is very interested in order. And so when they said, well, this is totally illegal, the response of the regime was to shift the ground of what is legal. And I think that there's a similar problem today in 2020 when we had 3 armed paramilitary groups roaming around the streets of my city and following Black Lives Matter demonstrators, being backed up by the police. There was kind of this view of them, oh, these are vigilantes. They're operating outside the law. The problem with that is kind of threefold. One is that vigilantism has a pretty positive view in like Hollywood movies of the hero who takes it upon himself to fight for his morals against politicians or bureaucrats that aren't protecting the people. Taking the law into their own hands is kind of the phrase that's often used. What these paramilitaries were is they weren't taking the law into their own hands. They were targeting people because of their race, religion, political beliefs. They were armed wings of fascist movements. Another problem is that if you look at this idea of illegal vigilantism, well, what happens in a situation when, as we had in Oregon during the wildfires, when a sheriff deputizes some of these guys and they set up roadblocks? Or when the White House starts telling the Proud Boys, stand by the January 6th situation. You have this tendency also to look at the excesses of far-right movements as well. They're breaking the law. In certain situations, the law is malleable and flexible. And so if you're hanging your hat on that idea of illegality, what happens when they're given this legal veneer? And I think that we face that kind of question in the U.S. as well. And I don't want to say Trump is like the Nazis, but I am saying that there's certain qualities of far-right movements that are pretty consistent through history and also from country to country. I mean, the idea of scapegoating people below you in the social ladder, of trying to divide the working class, of using either threats of violence or outright violence, extreme nationalism, whether it's white nationalism or I think increasing in strength in the far right is Christian nationalism, which may even include people of color. We've seen the Mark Robinson phenomenon in North Carolina. And these groups love to display, to highlight, showcase their token people of color in their far-right groups. You have those same kind of qualities in the European far-right. This time, of course, the main target is not Jews, it's immigrants, in particular Muslim immigrants, though I think that's broadening out in the current time. And what's actually interesting to me is that some of the current immigrants from places like Venezuela and Nicaragua are quite anti-socialist, but that doesn't do them any good, just like it didn't do Vietnamese refugees in Texas in the late 70s any good when the Klan was targeting Vietnamese fishermen, or for that matter, Cuban refugees in the 1980s. we kind of have some distinct paths that these far-right movements are following. The problem is if we just look at fascist movements when they're in power, we don't recognize how sophisticated they can be in order to reach power. When they're still social movements, when they're still exploiting kind of legitimate grievances of opposing fair trade, militarism, endless wars, environmental threats, even some are talking about climate change, unhealthy food, some of those gateway arguments and how that can attract people who are into, let's say, environmental or organic futures and how they can be drawn in to a far-right movement and not recognize it really until it's too late. And I think we have this simplistic kind of dual binary in the United States that either someone is a good guy or a bad guy. We have black hats and white hats in our movies. And in our political culture in general, we have two parties instead of a range of parties, and people can't recognize when there are shades of gray and are pretty easily sucked into these movements without many of them actually knowing about it and repeating some of their arguments without understanding the implications. And I'm sure you've dealt with that kind of issue on this program before.
Yeah, in particular in relation to the granola moms, to the QAnon world, or just the way that disinformation works.
And the anti-vax and the neo-pagan thing, which is particularly strong here in the Pacific Northwest. And I've written about this kind of what I call fascism denial, in the same way that there's climate change denial or COVID denial. It seems like such an existential threat that's so enormous and threatening that it can't possibly be real. And so we kind of don't understand, the inconvenient truths. And so we try and explain away. And I think before January 6th in particular, there was a tendency on the part of a lot of liberals, progressives, even radicals that, well, these people are a bunch of clowns, they're a bunch of rednecks. They've always been at the periphery. They're not really going to affect. And just like you don't notice climate change until there's a storm, because it's a gradual process, you don't notice fascism until there's a mass shooting like Pittsburgh or El Paso or January 6th. So there's a tendency of people, even when something like that happens, they put in they conflate it with the random mass shootings and talk about gun laws. Well, these aren't random mass shootings. They're not distributing the risk equally across society, where if you go to a mall or a theater or whatever, anyone can be killed in one of those random shoots. These are targeted shootings that affect a smaller sector. And to just kind of write it off, there's also kind of the idea that if they're not goose-stepping or wearing swastikas or hoods, that they're not really fascists. As I said before, there's kind of a tendency to reduce it to white supremacy when there's Christian supremacy. There's this super patriotic strain, in particular in the anti-immigrant movement. And I think in the United States, fascism is used as kind of shorthand for just like someone who's mean. The cops or the militarists in the Pentagon or someone who's putting you under surveillance is a fascist. And I think Europeans, Asians, Latin Americans who have actually experienced fascist movements understand it's a social movement, it's revolutionary, it's not seeking the status quo, but is seeking to overthrow it. It's not some generic hatred. It's based in specific conspiracy theories. And I think people are just not wanting to admit that this is a real threat because it says something about American democracy and the roots of our country in slavery, in genocide, in xenophobia that people don't want to admit. I hear from the Democrats almost a Make America Great Again kind of message. And this is not who we are. Far-right movements have always been embedded. We've had massacres in the past in our country against many peoples. And I just think it's naive to think that that can't happen again. And so the calls for mass deportation are in particular really, really scary. I've been really frustrated, and I didn't know why until I went to Europe and came back and started to hear this Civil War discourse over and over again. Oh, there's the red versus blue. There's going to be secession. There's going to be civil war. I couldn't put my finger on it, why it bugged me so much to hear that. And I finally realized, well, for one thing, as a political geographer, it's not red states against blue states. It's red counties against blue counties. If there was some kind of cataclysmic division, it would be more like the Bosnian Serb army surrounding Sarajevo, which it saw as decadent and multicultural. It would be more kind of rural militias coming into blue areas. But I just don't think there can be a civil war in the United States because one side has all the guns and they use them. There's been well over 100 people killed by the far right in the United States, only a tiny fraction by the left. The left, if it does get militant, it tends to target property and not people. I don't know a lot of people who own guns who are on the left or liberals, progressives, because we're into peace. And so it would be completely one-sided, unless you think of the idea that maybe the military could be divided. And there has been in the Iraq War and the Vietnam War, there was a lot of internal dissent. There would be even more dissent if soldiers were ordered to go on the streets, as Trump almost did in 2020. And so there could be divisions within the military, but not approaching a civil war. It really started to gel that here we are talking about a two-sided civil war that's not going to happen, when what we should really be worried about is a Kristallnacht, is a one-sided spasm of violence aimed at, in particular, refugees and undocumented workers, undocumented immigrants. But also it could be any enemies. It could be Muslims. It could be Jews. It could be real or perceived leftists in media or higher education. And these two assassination attempts scared the hell out of me, because what would be the spontaneous response by some of these armed Trump supporters? I remember the genocide in Rwanda started with the assassination of the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi. That was the signal to the Hutu militias to begin that process. I don't think it's inconceivable that this drive towards mass deportation could trigger something like that, only because mass deportation of 11 million undocumented immigrants, plus how many numbers of refugees like the Haitians and Venezuelans who are here legally, how could that possibly be done? The law enforcement, the police don't have the personnel to do it. It would be difficult to order the military because of dissent. That would probably happen within the military. If you have 43% people of color in the military, including many immigrants, how do you actually do this? The answer, I think, came in the debate. You begin to stoke fear and hatred, and so you create the conditions for a Kristallnacht, for some kind of national pogrom. I don't want to sound the alarm about something like that, but I just don't see anything right now standing in the way. You don't see significant pushback from the Harris campaign. Even when he said that, people were more laughing at him rather than taking this idea seriously.
I wanted to talk more with you about that. We always take a risk when we're being too predictive. So I wanted to go into possible scenarios next. But I did want to ask, what I've seen memes and laughter in the debate in the immediate aftermath from the Harris campaign. I've seen very little of actually naming the people that are being targeted, the Haitian community in Ohio, let alone the Haitian community nationwide from the Harris campaign. What is your take on how this is being responded to now in terms of the safety of the Haitian community?
I think it's gone beyond the Haitian community, because he's also targeted the Venezuelan community in Colorado and elsewhere.
In Aurora, yeah.
He's recently spoken about Congolese refugees. It's interesting. It seems to be refugees or asylum seekers more than undocumented people that he's targeting. That's consistent with some of the European far right, where that's their primary beef, is with the EU asylum rules. I think if we study history, we see this kind of targeted hysteria against other groups, in particular against Asians. I mean, some of it sounded very familiar to some of the anti-Chinese, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and some of the really intense racism that was used to justify that. Even though it was implemented more for economic reasons, they created the racial, not just hate, but fear and ridicule out of that.
Moral panic.
Yeah, this has happened before. And I think when people hear it and it sounds ridiculous, they tend to laugh without knowing the context, that this can and has led to real violence. And we're starting to see that. What's really disturbing is how open it is. In Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right anti-immigrant party, has been mobilizing, organizing, in particular in Eastern Germany, the former communist part of Germany. And so they've been drawn towards the AfD and have been doing well. They won one of the 3 recent elections and came very, very close in 2 of them in the Eastern German states. They did well in the European Parliament elections. They would have done better, but there was a leak of one of their internal discussions in January that they were looking at this idea of mass deportation. And that outraged Germans so much, even kind of conservative liberal Germans, that they had mass demonstrations. They said the AfD has revealed itself. There's been kind of a weird red-brown new party, which combines economic radicalism with an anti-immigrant, kind of anti-identity politics, anti-woke stance that has attracted some support away from the AfD. So it's not as strong as it was maybe last year, and yet it's winning elections.
It's making real victories.
Yeah, they're real victories. And the worst that they've gotten is that they might do a mass deportation because of the secret recording. And here at Trump rallies, it's right there on the signs. It's beyond exposing the people because they're very much open about it. I think that if there was a move towards mass deportation, you would see mass mobilizations of immigrant communities and their allies, like the general strikes that took place in 2006 and 2017. You would see real pushback in the country, even, I think, within the military. So I think it is important to reach people in the armed forces. I've been involved in GI organizing here around Joint Base Lewis McChord, which is the largest military base on the West Coast, during the Iraq War. There was a coffee shop set up by anti-war veterans and a lot of interaction with the soldiers. I think for movements to actually engage with them and say, this is a real possibility. You might be sent into the streets of even your home city, because they would actually take guides from home cities in order to go into areas and to talk about ways to either openly dissent against it or kind of the more behind the scenes subterranean kind of slowing down the system, which was really successful in Vietnam and Iraq and could be here as well. It's also the experience in California in the 90s when the anti-immigrant governor, Pete Wilson, instituted these new laws. It was a proposition, Prop 187, that required providers, like health providers, educational providers, to report undocumented people. They were going to be forbidden to use non-emergency health care, public education, other services. And there was mass non-compliance, so much so that even though it passed with a majority, it eventually collapsed. And eventually a judge ruled against it. And so you would have to have massive noncompliance. You would have to have people having some kind of ability to shelter in other people's homes to avoid the idea of allyship, going beyond kind of symbolism and putting up signs. You know what happened in Europe in the 1940s of having to hide people out, frustrating, sabotaging the ability to gather lists and to computerize databases and all these kinds of things that would be necessary to round up 11 million plus people. And I really do think that is a strategy, whether it's using the military, police, or some kind of a pogrom. We have to get ready for a Kristallnacht. We can't just think it's going to be like January 6th and there's going to be election boards subverted and there are going to be court cases. I think they're ready this time to just kind of overwhelm the system. I wish I wasn't feeling like that. And I don't think it was just because I went to Europe and it scared the hell out of me to learn that history. I think that there are signs that there really are no limits to this, and to begin to stoke almost a hatred of subhumans really is going beyond a lot of the arguments of even the anti-immigrant movement in Europe, where they couch it in, well, we have a cultural society and these people are infringing on the cultural society, and they're kind of careful not to go there in Europe. But I think right now in the US, the signs are there, the warnings are there on the wall, and we'd be naive to ignore them.
Yeah, and they're not whispers, they're screams. And we have the history of fascist movements, and we have what Trump said and then did in his time in power. Then the whole period after that of strengthening this fascist movement. Those are not for nothing. There's the phrase, when they tell you who they are, believe them. They're screaming who they are, and they've been doing it for some time now. And at this point, to think otherwise is to put your head in the sand. I think that the cost is so high for real human beings who are in the crosshairs of this movement, which, yes, fascism comes for everyone, but there are people who it is targeting right now. I think your point on actually preparing and what that means and for people to be thinking about that now is really important. I wanted to get your perspective. A lot of people are focused on November 5th and the idea that if he's trounced, then it's done. And I think that we've learned that they've said multiple times, not just Trump, but as a whole movement, that they won't accept anything other than a victory. And I think it's foolish at this point to not take that seriously. But I would like your perspective on what you see the possibilities looking like.
You've seen how these movements have consolidated in places like my parents' homeland, Hungary, with Viktor Orban taking over the reins of power and keeping out opposition candidates and kind of refiguring the society so the media and the courts are done. In Israel with the far-right parties, the fascist parties in the cabinet, and unleashing havoc on Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon. And so you have these precedents of these movements being successful, and even when they lose, they're building momentum through organizing social movements and through violence. I mean, we've seen recent anti-immigrant riots in Britain, in Ireland even, where they are targeting immigrants and putting these kind of social democratic governments on the defensive. And we've seen the Democratic Party itself turn from a rather pro-immigrant party, at least rhetorically, to one that's talking about strengthening the border, et cetera, et cetera. And we have this tendency also in France of the far-right movement setting the agenda even for liberal and social democratic governments, because those governments try to out-immigrant bash the immigrant bashers and think that they can weaken the far-right in the process. But every time, Germany is a great example, the recent elections, and France, where Macron was consulting with Le Pen over who's going to be prime minister and the new cabinet, you see this kind of leaving the door open to the fascists because these liberal parties hate the pro-immigrant left more than they hate the anti-immigrant right. And so we have a situation like before World War II, where it became increasingly normalized for fascists to be in power. Even if Harris wins and actually takes office, maybe not power, but takes office, you're still having this drive towards mass deportation. If anything, it would be even more extra legal, not using necessarily the reins of power, but using direct violence in order both to terrorize immigrants and others, and also try to weaken this liberal or social democratic party that's in power in the process. And we see even in Canada, not the far right, but kind of right-wing party very much probably coming to power next year. To me, it's a long haul. It's not something that's short-term, that's solved by a particular election. Whether they're in power or out of power, they're growing in their sense of legitimacy. Trump taking power and showing us who he really was actually was a wake-up call for a lot of people. I remember the Obama election in 2008, where a lot of people went to sleep. A lot of people would oppose the Iraq War, fought for racial justice, said, well, that's it. We've won. And the social movement was weakened by a successful election. And so we can't afford to do that this time because the far right is way too powerful. I think there are ways in counter-organizing. I think counter-recruitment in high schools is particularly important because that's where a lot of kids are getting a far-right message. Much too much attention is on college campuses, not enough on the high schools. I think it's important to organize beyond the large cities and not just rural areas, but in between places like small cities where there hasn't been necessarily mass support. You know, in a rural area, you're afraid of rocking the boat because you don't want to be ostracized by your neighbors. In an urban area, you've had a lot of ability to join a movement or express your opinion. There's greater safety in numbers. It's in those in-between places like York, Pennsylvania, or La Crosse, Wisconsin, that a lot more work needs to be done. What I've been really interested in my work with Native communities is what's called unlikely alliances. And I have a book by that title, which looks at some deep red areas and white farmers, ranchers, and fishers who once opposed the tribes on treaty rights, on resources like fish and water, but faced with an outside threat like a mining company, fossil fuels, even a military project, have joined together with the tribes. And so you can draw some of these communities that have been open to a right-wing populist message because nobody else has tried to talk with them. There's been a vacuum left, in particular in rural areas, but also in these smaller cities, by progressives who feel like, oh, that's just a cultural, political wasteland. We have safety in the big cities. To engage some of these folks and draw them away from a right-wing populist, racist message, I've seen it happen. And stopping some of the world's largest mining companies and oil pipelines and coal trains when people have a sense that they're defending common ground. And in the process, a lot of the white folks learn about Native culture and Native sovereignty. I've seen areas where that vacuum has been filled by something more positive. You can have kind of counter to the far right, which isn't just about combating them or exposing them, but also about offering an alternative that is counterposed not just to the far right, but also to business as usual, to the neoliberal economics and the establishment parties. So to try and take some of those legitimate grievances that are exploited by the far right, so all they're left with is their extreme racism and their extreme misogyny. That's how you expose them for what they really are. If you allow them to take on these other issues against free trade deals, against endless wars, against contaminated food, then you've ceded the ground to them. And if you refuse to engage with people, you've basically handed them over to the far right. It's not that they're angry. Their anger is legitimate. It's just directed at the wrong targets. It's directed below them in society rather than upwards to the real sources of their problems.
Going off of what you were saying, there's this line in your counterpunch essay I wanted to lift up, quote, by preparing and organizing for these grim possibilities, we can have more proactive ways to respond than relying on our weakened legal system and not be caught surprised again, end quote. And I wanted to ask, what does it look like for people to prepare for these possibilities? What could those listening walk away with in terms of what they can do now? You know, someone was writing, well, is preparing just being aware and spreading this possibility and that's it? I feel like there's something else I'm supposed to be doing. What is it? I wanted to give you a chance to speak to that.
Yeah, I think part of it is awareness. Part of it is, I'm thinking back to the sanctuary movement for Central American refugees where churches were opening themselves up. And I think the discourse of dehumanization is so strong right now. And when you have both parties participating in it and posing immigrants and legal refugees as the problem that needs to be solved, I think the primary emotion that's important in countering is not anger. As I said before, people have legitimate reasons to be angry at their lot in life. It's dehumanization. The opposite of dehumanization is humanization, to really, at every opportunity, to tell the stories of, in particular, the refugees and other immigrants, to humanize their stories is incredibly important because we're not hearing that from any of our leaders right now. Another thing is the idea of mutual aid, which became popularized during the pandemic, and people watching out for each other and to understand that when things break out in neighborhoods, people are going to need resources. People are going to need places to temporarily go to hide, to basically let neighbors know that we're going to be there for you, whether on a family basis or a community basis. And I think going beyond that, working with some of the existing pro-immigrant networks that are out there and seeing what their needs are at this point. I think that that's essential. I don't have the answers to organizing this mass movement and response. I think so much of it is proactive and to give some other alternatives to some of the people who might be reached. That's, I think, the most important part of what we need to do. But that's not something we can do between now and Election Day or between now and the inauguration. And it's something that should continue no matter who's in power in the White House or Congress. But when it comes to responding, we have to think about the possibility of a real disaster, much like preparing for an earthquake or a flood or wildfires. We have to be prepared as a society for an outbreak of violence of some kind or threats of violence that immobilize people, which is even more pervasive. I think that in the long haul, with a younger population in the United States, that's one advantage we have in the United States, because in some countries, France, Hungary, Israel, the young people are more right-wing than the older people. And you've seen that in some of the election results in Germany in recent days. Since we do have younger people who are more open to cultural diversity, to gender diversity, to economic equality, to be encouraging and working with youth on that, I think is a real direction. And it gives me some hope that maybe the future is brighter. It's just the present that sucks.
Well, I think part of it is, as you were saying before, it doesn't, to a certain extent, it's not just about the numbers or about the majority having a certain opinion, but then how that opinion gets acted upon and becomes a force in the world. If everything is seen as being decided November 5th and everything has a neat little bow on it and then it's done, we're in a very, very dangerous spot. One of the strengths, while it wiped their hands of the fascism, it was a very good thing that in Germany, when it became open, that these were the kinds of talks that was happening, that people did flood the streets. We are in a very bad place that needs to change soon, where horrible, horrific, dehumanizing, the most language of terror about immigrants can go on ad nauseum. And people might write a few words on Twitter or pen an editorial in a paper, but in terms of visible resistance that says we're not going to have business as normal when you're terrorizing a whole people, we're not there. And that is a sign of such levels of normalization, of such bigotry. It's not affecting me. It's not affecting my life. I'm just going to go about and worry about me and mine. We got to break out of that, and we got to break out of that quick. When I think about preparing, I think about these types of things. If we can get on better footing around, no, we're not going to let people be dehumanized. No, we're not going to let really the mass murder of women happen because of ripping away the right to abortion. We're not going to let that go down. We're not going to accept the criminalization of pregnant women for the choices they make in their life. We're not going to live in that society. I think the more that we can have that culture, the better position we're going to be in to respond to threats or acts of violence. That's just my thought.
Yeah, and I think that people power movements that have been successful, they go beyond electoral politics. For one thing, they go into community action. They may not have majority sentiment in the society, but they use their numbers in protests and strikes and non-compliance and frustrating operations of oppression. Some might get so frustrated that they do resort to fighting back physically, and I don't have moral qualms. I believe in right to self-defense, but we do have to remember that the far right is far better armed than anything that people could come up with, and you're kind of playing on their ground if you resort to that. And so our strength historically, if you read stuff like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, our strength has been in people power, educating and mobilizing large numbers of people, even when we're not the majority, in order to do things like stop wars, in order to get some modicum of social justice. It's been done successfully before in our history, and it can be again. And actually, we're in better shape now than we were at the turn of the century, when really the only multi-issue movement was the movement against the WTO. There wasn't much going on when Bush stole the Electoral College in 2000. We've had Occupy, we've had climate justice movements, we've had Black Lives Matter, we've had Idle No More and Standing Rock, we've had the reaction to Trump and some of the amazing takeover of airports and transportation networks that took place when he first came to power. I mean, people have got to think about that on a massive scale to try and use people power to shut down the system if they are actually moving towards mass deportation, to kind of gum up the works. We do have it within us. We do have experience. We have a lot of young people hooked up on social media with all its problems. We have the ability to mobilize people in ways that haven't been done before. And I've seen actually hopeful sign this movement for Palestine, I think, has been sustained over months and months with rather large numbers of people involved, at least that I've seen. To have the staying power to stand up to collective punishment and ethnic cleansing, and if it comes to it, to stand up to genocide, not just in other countries, but to recognize that our own country has historically and in the 21st century is not immune to these things happening in other parts of the world. So understanding the rest of the world, what has happened in other places, as a way to understand what's happening in our backyard, and also understanding our own backyard to better understand what's happening in other places. Our own history of settler colonialism informing us about settler colonialism elsewhere, for instance. I think Americans are easily freaked out because we feel that we've been isolated from wars and pogroms. But if you understand our own history, if you understand what's happening in other countries, you understand that is it rather common in the world. But it's also quite common to have uprisings and rebellions and noncompliance with it that actually shuts it down. And people in post-fascist countries like Spain, like South Africa, like Chile understand that very well. And they've faced far greater repression and oppression than we have in the United States in terms of like secret police and surveillance and torture. And we feel like if there's an infiltrator in our group that we've reached absolute dictatorship. Well, we haven't, because it can get far worse, but also our response to it can be far more intense.
I think that's a great place to stop. I want to thank you so much, Zoltán, for coming on and sharing your perspective, your insight, your expertise. I can't help but think that your background in Native American and Indigenous studies gives you keen insight into parts of what is shaping up here, including learning from that vast history in our ability to understand what has and is happening. So I want to express my gratitude, and we will link to your Counterpunch essay, of course, in the show notes. But is there anywhere else that if people want to read more from you?
Yeah, if you go on my faculty website, and I think it might be in the bio, and you link maybe in particular to the Indigenous and anti-racism writings that I have posted there, that might be the best place for people to kind of follow up.
We will definitely link to that. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and really appreciate the opportunity, and glad to see that you're spreading the word and doing good work.
This coming week marks 1 year since the beginning of the full-scale genocide of the people of Gaza, which Israel has only continued to escalate over that time with the full backing of both the fascists and the liberal camps of the U.S. ruling class. As American media hypothesizes over a potential quote-unquote October surprise scandal to affect the election, we may very well see nuclear war kick off before November 5th. We send love to the people of Gaza, the people of Lebanon, the people of Yemen, and we salute all who are in the streets this week demanding an end to this atrocity. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Again, I hope you'll join us to discuss Wargame this upcoming Sunday, October 13th. Register and get the Zoom link over at patreon.com/refusefascism. If you're not a patron yet, you can change that today for as little as $2 a month at the same place. See link in the show notes, but it's patreon.com/refusefascism. It all makes a difference in producing and promoting this independent, all volunteer weekly podcast. Thanks for your support, and I look forward to seeing you Sunday. As always, please share the show with others, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen, or comment on our social posts or YouTube uploads. It makes an impact and is so appreciated. And of course, follow, subscribe wherever you listen so you never miss an episode. As always, we love hearing from you. Find us on social media at Refuse Fascism. Find us on YouTube at Refuse_Fascism. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if YouTube is your thing, or leave us a voicemail. See the link in the show notes for how to do that. There's a little button when you click the link. And if you want to reach me at Twitter at Sam B. Goldman. I'm still sadly on that house site. drop me a line at Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org if email's your thing, or over on the TikToks at Sam Goldman RF. Thanks to Mark Tinkelman, Richie Marini, and Lena Thorne for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers. We have transcripts available for each show, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.